Emma scanned the scene in front of her, adjusting her camera strap over her shoulder. A few feet away, the parents posed with their two sons in a perfect line, their golden retriever sitting obediently at their feet. The setting sun bathed the family in a soft golden light, creating the ideal backdrop for a heartwarming portrait. "All right, a couple more shots," Emma called out with a cheerful tone. "Lean in a bit closer. Mom and Dad, hold still for a second. Boys, perfect." She clicked the shutter several times, capturing the playful grins of the boys and the relaxed laughter of their parents. The atmosphere was light and filled with joy, yet Emma couldn't shake the faint unease that had settled over her. She chalked it up to exhaustion. After all, being a professional photographer came with its share of long hours and challenging shoots. As she reviewed the photos on her camera screen, her stomach knotted. Her finger hovered over the display as she zoomed in on one of the images. A detail caught her eye, and her breath hitched. Could it be a smudge on the lens? A trick of the light? She adjusted her camera, wiping the lens with a cloth before taking another shot. This time she focused intently on the youngest boy's hand. The image flashed on the screen, and there it was again. A small, distinct birthmark on the boy's wrist. Emma's heart raced, her palms growing clammy as she stared at the screen. It couldn't be. The birthmark was identical to the one she'd seen on her own son 3 years ago, before he was taken from her. "Is everything all right?" The mother's voice broke through Emma's daze, tinged with concern. Emma forced a smile, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh yes, just making sure the lighting's perfect." She snapped a few more pictures, her mind racing. Could it really be him? Or was she grasping at straws, desperate to find a connection where none existed? Her thoughts spiraled back to that fateful day 3 years ago. She'd been overjoyed to welcome her first child, a baby boy, into the world. She could still recall the weight of him in her arms, his tiny fingers curling around hers, and the faint cry that had filled her heart with a mix of wonder and love. But that joy had been cruelly snatched away. The nurses had taken her son for a routine checkup, and when Emma woke from a light nap, the hospital was in chaos. Doctors whispered among themselves, avoiding her gaze. When the police arrived, she knew something was terribly wrong. "Your baby," a nurse had stammered, her voice shaking. He's gone." Despite extensive investigations, security footage reviews, and relentless questioning, her son had vanished without a trace. The police suspected foul play, but the case grew cold. Emma had been left with nothing but grief and a single vivid memory, the small crescent-shaped birthmark on her son's wrist. Over the years, Emma had thrown herself into her photography, documenting the milestones and joys of other families while quietly nursing her own heartbreak. She visited orphanages, scanned crowds, and examined every child she photographed, searching for that birthmark. But as time passed, hope dwindled. Her son was gone and the world had moved on. Until now. Emma's chest tightened as she repositioned the family, struggling to maintain her professional demeanor. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her camera. After a few more shots, she knew she couldn't leave without answers. With her heart pounding, she lowered her camera and approached the couple, her voice faltering. "Excuse me," she began hesitantly. "This might sound strange, but how old is your youngest?" The mother, Mrs. Smith, tilted her head curiously but smiled. "He's 3. Emma's breath caught, her pulse quickened. This couldn't be a coincidence. He's adorable," she managed, her voice shaking. "You must be very proud." Mrs. Smith beamed. "Oh, we are. He's the best decision we ever made." "Decision?" Emma asked cautiously, her throat tightening. "We adopted him," Mrs. Smith explained warmly. "When he was about a year old. He's been such a blessing." Emma's hands clenched as she fought to steady herself. "May I ask which orphanage?" "St. Anne's," Mrs. Smith replied, her smile faltering slightly at Emma's intense expression. "Just outside the city. They were wonderful to work with." Emma's mind reeled. She'd visited St. Anne's multiple times during her search but had never come across any leads. Could she have missed something? Her gaze flickered to the boy, her eyes filling with tears as she noticed the birthmark again. "This might sound strange," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But your son, the birthmark on his wrist, I lost my baby 3 years ago. He was taken from the hospital, and the only thing I remember is a mark, just like that one." The Smiths exchanged shocked glances. Mr. Smith stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Are you saying—" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I think he might be my son." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainty. DNA tests were arranged, and Emma spent sleepless nights reliving the photo shoot, her mind plagued by doubts and fears. What if she was wrong? What if she'd gotten her hopes up only to have them crushed again? When the results finally arrived, they confirmed what Emma's heart had already told her. The boy was her son. Overwhelmed with emotion, she struggled to process the news. The Smiths were equally shaken but responded with compassion and grace. "We had no idea," Mrs. Smith said tearfully. "We've loved him as our own, but if he's truly your son—" Emma shook her head, her voice firm but kind. "You've given him a wonderful life. I'm not here to take him away. I just want to be a part of his life." In a touching gesture, the Smiths arranged a reunion. Emma finally held her son again, tracing the birthmark on his small hand as tears streamed down her face. He looked up at her with innocent curiosity, and she felt the years of pain and longing melt away. Mrs. Smith placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "You're his mother. He belongs with you. But if you'll allow it, we'd love to stay in his life too." Emma smiled through her tears. "I'd be honored. He's lucky to have you both." What began as a routine photo shoot had turned into a life-changing miracle. Emma's search was over, but her journey was just beginning. Together with the Smiths, she embarked on a new chapter filled with love, hope, and second chances.